Bum 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 bum. The Battle of Arausio. Now, this is an interesting battle. It's an interesting battle for many reasons. One, it is the largest army the Romans had got together since the Second Punic War at this point. It is probably the second largest defeat of the Romans after the Battle of Cannae. And I would argue it is more important than the Punic Wars in shaping the Rome that we all know and talk about so much in sort of when we're talking about popular history of Rome. I will start, though, by quoting someone who was certainly not Roman. And for want of a better description of their role in my life, I would call them an instructor. He was a former NCO. And he used to say this: those who don't learn lessons from defeats are doomed to a second defeat. Those who don't learn lessons from victory are doomed to lose. Which was a rather interesting statement, but a very pertinent one. There is often a sort of thing which goes around military history and the military in terms of you get these ideas that people say, oh, well, only the military know what war's like. On a personal level, it's probably true. On a strategic, operational, historical levels, there are people who've done a lot of research, and there are people who straddle those fields and who straddled it and have done a lot of research. There is a problem, though, in that you will get a lot of focus on doing the job in front of you. The job in front of you, 90% of the time in the military, is not fighting a war. It's running a military. It's patrolling, it's presence, it's doing all those missions which you do in peacetime. That is most of your life. And you can lose the understanding that you've learnt from war, the lessons you've learnt from war, very, very quickly if you do not have a way to retain them. Currently in the UK, there is a debate going on about the Royal Navy and its military education of officers. I've always been of the view that officers and NCOs need training. They need the experience. They need to be passed on the lessons that history has given us. The reason they need to have those lessons passed on is because of two things. One, in wartime, there might not be the time to give the people who are promoted into posts the formal education. So you need a lot of people around them to have had the formal education so they can pass on those lessons. If NCOs have learnt from the military history and officers have learnt from the military history, then the personnel, the officers and NCOs around them, will often get that information passed on in conversation. They won't get the full extent, but they'll get a distillate. And then when they go for the training, they get the training and they have the history given to them as part of their development, as part of their training, as part of their learning strategy and understanding and security and all those things. It's useful. Why? because you will never have enough time to give officers and NCOs enough time in doing exercises, doing simulations, to give them preparation for everything. And therefore, whilst you can prepare them for possibly 20% of their task that way, and 20% will be the training and following the rules, the remaining 60%, you need to find another way to give it to them. You need to give them some preparation. You might not be able to train them. You're just hoping that they will follow their own understanding and follow the guidelines. But if you give them the history of where those guidelines came from, that will save them from a lot of trouble. Now, this is where this account comes in. This is from Garnius Lucianus, who is another of those historians of Rome. And this is an English translation because, frankly, I didn't want to do the Latin the whole way through because I was worried, A, my pronunciation might go wrong, and B, then I'd have to do the English anyway because not as many people speak Latin as should do, in my opinion. And I'm sorry if the screen's shaking at all. I have no idea why. It's all set up so it shouldn't shake. But to make it less obvious, I'm going to quickly use my fleece to cover this bit behind me because maybe it's the autofocus or something. Yeah, that makes it slightly better. Slightly better. The ex-consul, M. Aurelius Saccharis, was thrown from his horse and captured by the Cimbri. When they summoned him to a council, he neither did nor said anything which was unworthy of a Roman, who had held such great honours. Because of this, he was killed, although he could have escaped. He refused their request to act as their leader, out of shame that he should survive after the loss of his army. Begging Scipio to confront the Gauls with a large combined army. But Scipio refused. Scipio crossed the Rhone and boasted to his soldiers that he would bring help to the frightened consul, but he did not even want to discuss with him how to conduct the war, and he disdained to listen to the envoys whom the Senate sent asking the generals to cooperate and jointly to protect the state. The Cimbri sent envoys to arrange a peace and to ask for land and for corn to sow, but he dismissed them so brusquely that they attacked the next day. His camp was situated not far away from Mallius's camp, but he could not be persuaded, though he was so close, to join together their armies. The greater part of the army was destroyed. The battle was fought on the day before the Nones of October. Rutilius Rufus says that at least 70,000 regular troops and light-armed troops perished on this day. Rufus was the senior consul at the time, and he was nowhere near this battle. He was back in Rome. He was the one reporting it afterwards. Our own matron, acting as if disturbed and in the mind, sat on the throne of Jupiter. Therefore, the Capitolium was ritually cleansed. A statue of Mars was said to have fallen its head in territory of Sabines, and some time before the games were planned, when the trumpet players sounded their instruments by the altar, black snakes suddenly appeared and continued to swarm in front of the altar and bite many of the bystanders until the trumpets fell silent. Then the snakes suddenly vanished. Several matrons came forward after being warned by the same dream and on the same night with a message about sacred offerings, and several sacrifices were performed on this account. The noblest of boys sang a hymn to the gods, which had been specially composed by a poet. All these things are probably not true in their regard. For starters, we know some of these things are not true. This is an account which is published later by a Roman historian, which is bringing together some of the things that happen and some of the history that's remembered. And the reason we know it's not true is because some of the other accounts by Roman historians. Now, the thing is, this account, well, if you read through it, it's kind of interesting, because let's start off with Scarus is thrown from his horse. Okay. Ex-consul. Consul Secus. So he's given a consul title as reward for having been killed. He's legate in this battle. They summon him to a council. Why would you summon him to a council to interrogate him? Probably that's more likely. And he didn't settle on anything that was unworthy of Roman. But apparently they offered him leadership of their army. Why would two tribes offer leadership of their army to a Roman? We're two kings and we're going to support ourselves to a Roman who we just defeated in battle and who was leading a small cavalry detachment at the time. That doesn't quite sound correct, does it? Think about it. It's not really kosher. Asking for him for his advice? Do you often ask your recently defeated opponent for their advice on how to deploy your forces? Possibly they were asking him to act as an envoy. We'll release you on your honor to go and talk to the Roman army for us. That is a potential one. Mallius was alarmed at the Verdus victory of Cimbri. Mallius was the consul. Please note he doesn't mention the fact that Scipio is the proconsul. Scipio had been consul previous year. This meant that Scipio is the junior to Mallius. He's supposed to do what he's told by Mallius. And Mallius was alarmed by this victory. Well, Scarus was his scouting party, and the Cimbri have just attacked it, so that means they're 30 miles away, and he sent a letter begging or requesting. As it is, Scipio hadn't really joined with them. Had set up his army on the other side of his own consular army on the other side of the river. And then when he had crossed the Rhone, he set his army up in a different position. And disdained to listen to the envoys which the Senate sent, which are asking the generals to cooperate, or rather, for Scipio to do what he was supposed to do and subordinate himself to the command of the consul, which is the Roman way, the Roman instruction manual, the command structure they're supposed to be following. And then Cimbri send peace envoys to arrange peace and to ask for land and corn. But they don't send them to the proconsul, who had been fighting them the previous year and waiting for them to attack. That was Scipio. They send them to Mallius, who's the consul. And it's not Mallius who they attack, and it's not, well, it's Mallius who they eventually attack, but it's not Scipio who they attack. Scipio attacks them and loses. And then they attack Mallius. The trouble is, Scipio has the veteran army, which is reduced in numbers because of fighting, and Mallius has the new army, raised this year. So it's full, but it's inexperienced and only been brought together not that long ago, really. Rutilius Rufus is the senior consul of the year. Mallius is the junior consul, but the senior consul has been unwell, I would say. We will talk about that later, and that's why he hasn't gone out to fight. So let's talk about Marcus Aurelius Scaurus. Let's put out what he was at the time. He was a legate. Now, a legate is second in command of a force, senior legate. Otherwise known as sometimes the senior military tribune of an army, or legionary legate, is in charge of it. Now, depending upon the commander, whether it's a praetor or propraetor or consul or proconsul, can depend on how many legates they have them. If you have a full consular army and you have, let's say, 6 legions, you could well have 6 to 8 legions combined together. You could have multiple legates. You would probably have a legate per legion to act as the legionary legate in charge of the legion. Its commander. The tribunes run it, but each legion would have a commander, because each legion is a sort of mini army on its own. And the legates, then you might have more senior ones who will take other posts. You would have your senior legate in charge of reconnaissance, your senior legate in charge of logistics, and all these things. And they could also be tribunes if you're a more junior, a praetor, but, it depends on you. They could either be incredibly seasoned officers or ambitious young senators out to prove themselves. It's very rare your second in command is going to be anything other than a very experienced officer. Other legates can be junior. There are ways you can get around having a junior, less experienced officer as a legate. Good thing to do is to stick them in charge of legions. That might sound strange, but there are sufficiently enough tribunes, etc., that they can act as experience. But the whole point of this is that the Roman command system is designed to produce a pool of experience at the top. It's not all dependent upon one person having experience, but you cannot get there if you don't. Marcus Aurelius Scaurus was the senior legate of Consul Gnaeus Malus Maximus. He was sent north to construct a cavalry camp post 30 miles from the main force. Basically, it's a picket post. You're supposed to have pickets out further than the 30 miles, and then this is their operating position from. The battle at the camp, began when his camp, which was a reconnaissance tripwire position, was overrun. Ouch. That's not good. How did that happen? You're the pickets and the scouts. You're not supposed to be overrun. You're supposed to be on horseback long before the enemy get to you. So either it was enemy cavalry and they managed to get very, very close, or you're really, really bad at your job and enemy infantry got close. Considering he was taken alive and forced off his horse, that sounds like an infantryman. We go back to this incredibly persuasively positive, for someone account, thrown from his horse and captured by the Cimbri. Okay, well, maybe not cavalry. Maybe it was cavalry, but it still doesn't sound that good. Thrown from his horse sounds like a lovely way of putting it, but if we consider the other biases already in the account, are we willing to rule out the idea that they were taken by surprise by infantry? Now, the various accounts of what happened next, let's be honest. Basically, what happens, as I understand it, is, for whatever reason, he's being interrogated by the king. And instead of probably being sensible, but either way, he's probably going to die, so I suppose you might as well go out honorably. But you could have just kept your mouth shut. He decides to tell the king that he will get destroyed by the massed Roman armies and he's going to be begging for mercy, and he ends up getting executed. So he's declared consul suffectus by the Senate in tribute for his service. Now that means that's basically the equivalent of someone being declared as a consul suffectus is someone who's appointed consul for the remainder of the year. A full consul is a person who's appointed who is elected for the whole year, and so the years are named after those consuls. Usually, you'll be in your 40s, 50s, and 60s to be a consul. There's a reason for that. 10 years are supposed to elapse between your various terms as consul. You do it for a year. If you are a patrician, you can get there when you're 40. If you're a not patrician family, you can get there when you're 42. Either way, you need to have ticked certain boxes along the way to get there. You can't just jump in and go, I would like to run for consul. It's kind of an interesting point when we consider our own modern electoral systems. Basically, the idea is, no, you're not allowed to run for this office if you're under a certain age. You can run for a more junior office, that's fine, but you're not running for the top office until you've been experienced in both the political and military systems. Basically, the Roman system of magistrate election is training for government and training for military leadership, which is what they need their senior people to be able to do. It works when it works well. So, this is the rough migration pattern of the Cimbri, Teutons, and Ambrones. Now, the Ambrones do slightly different things, but basically the Cimbri and the Teutons who seem to be very, very close together, come down from possibly Jutland, but honestly, they're quite large, and I have this feeling that if they came down by sea, especially if you consider where they were heading in terms of their choices, they seem to be wanting to head for fertile grounds. Now, if you had access to boats and ships at the time, I think you could probably make a case for wandering down the coast. So I'm maybe there was a very 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 cold winter, and they came off Jutland by ice through the Baltic. But myself, I'm reckoning that's not quite their route. The Romans lost twice: Noria and Arausio. They won twice: Aquae Sextae and Versailles, both times afterwards. Now, let's consider the barbarians. And please note, I do put that in quotation marks for various reasons. The Cimbri are from the Jutland area, and archaeologists are not really certain on this, but that's where we roughly think they are from the accounts given. The migration seems to start roughly 120 BC, roughly. They invaded lands of the Tarsi and Nosorium in 113 BC. They defeated the Romans at the Battle of Noria this year. They invaded Gaul in 109 BC, as despite the road to Rome being open, they decided it was best to go for the land which had a lot more ability to produce corn. They were looking for a place to grow food. They are not a hunter-gatherer civilization, they're a farming civilization that are moving. They're a tribe of farmers that are moving to find a better place to grow food and sustain their population, because where they've got isn't supporting them anymore. The Teutons, under King Teutobod. Now, Teutobod is an interesting one, because I'm not sure if that's his name. Now, let me explain this. Boreax sounds like a name, especially to Cimbri. Teutobod. I have read various accounts of various historians and archaeologists on this subject. And I bow down to the fact that they are Roman specialists, and I am merely war studies and a passionate enjoyer of Roman history. But Teutobod sounds more like a title to me than a name. Possibly it's the name which the king takes. Again, not an unusual practice in certain civilizations, so it is quite possible that when you become king of the Teutons, you become Teutobod. Prior to that point, who cares what your name was, but the moment you are king, you are Teutobod. We have even a less of an idea where they came from, but they seem to have a very good relationship with the Cimbri, which suggests to me that they weren't too unrelated. They are incredibly close allies with the Ambrones as well. They also appear to have a significant knowledge of Roman culture and law, if some stories are to be believed. Now, let's put this in context. I am British. If the accent is a shock to you and the whole personality, then I am sorry for shocking you, but I am British. I understand the British legal system to an extent, mostly second-hand, thanks to friends who are lawyers, not through personal experience. And I know through picking it up, you know the various penalties of various things and the various options. I know, although I haven't had to use it, touch wood, that if you want to do speeding, if you get a speeding fine, you can parlay it into a driving course, a speed awareness driving course, which is a very good thing. And is, I have to admit, tempting to do anyway, but I prefer not to go do the whole speeding fine route to get to it. I think I might just do the course. You can. Because it's fun to do some driving training every year. It's a good thing. It's like anything in life. If you do some training every year in something, you keep the skill sharp. Now, despite speaking English, despite understanding British law, and despite watching many American legal television programs in my time when I've been writing late in the evening and televisions have been on, I do not know the American legal system. I don't know this. Don't know the Australian or Scottish, Australian or New Zealand. I'd even be slightly more circumspect about the Scottish rather than the English portion of the British legal system, because the Scottish law is slightly different. And whilst, again, I have family up there and I have gone up there and spent a lot of time up there, I do know there are differences in law, and I don't know them all. For example, you have the right to roam in Scotland. You don't in England. You really don't. The point I'm making here is they understand some of the legal niceties and options open to a consul, and they ask for them. Now, where do you get that knowledge? And let's explain this. And this is part of their understanding of the Roman scenario. The surrender terms, when they eventually lose, included 300 married women were to become concubines and slaves for the Romans. Now, let's be honest, these are 300 noble-born women. They're going to be senior. No one's going to, in this time, at this period we're talking about, no one gives a flying hoot about the lower-born, lower-class women. They are probably already slaves at this point. They've probably already been captured or are running away for their lives. Latter is the most sensible option. On learning this, the women beg the consul to instead become servants in the temple of Ceres and Venus. Now, again, this is not going to be an option to low-born women. You're going to need a certain level of status to be able to qualify for these things. This is denied, so they killed their children and themselves rather than face the life they knew was coming. Now, understanding the life that's coming is very simple. Most slavery and the experience of that is quite common this period. And let's be honest, the whole interesting whole thing about slaves is it's got a root in the word Slav, which is a name for many Eastern European peoples. So, yeah. Fun times. So they know what's coming. But they also know this option. They know it. Sorry. Boom. That's a lot of knowledge, if you think about it, of Roman history, precedent, and culture. Not even sure all Romans would have known that. Let alone noblewomen who, theoretically, their only link with Rome was, what, invading them? Second-hand through trade or captured slaves? Why would Romans who've been captured by them be helping them out their legal defense? This suggests to me that there had been a lot of links and a lot of knowledge transferred over many years. The Romans were understood by these people, which makes the Teutons perhaps even more of a mystery. Potentially, they had been allies, clients of Rome. We don't really know, but they seem to have a significant knowledge of Rome. So let's look at the Romans. I have no pictures of these people. Probably good for their sake, because I could be making fun of them right now. We have the consul, which means that they've been elected this year. So they are elected consul of 105 BC. For Transalpine Gaul, Gnaeus Malleus Maximus, a novus homo, a new man. A new man! Someone who's risen up by dint of skill and effort. So when people say he was inexperienced or didn't have the knowledge or this, that, and the other, they are talking probably twaddle. Because whilst you can say you have the inexperience, etc., to actually get to the role, you're going to need to amass some experience. Proconsul, that means they'd been the consul the previous year, were considered to do a good job, and were kept in charge of their army. Quintus Servilius Scipio. Consul for Transalpine Gaul, consul for Cisalpine Gaul. Scipio had passed an interesting law which required jurymen to be chosen from senators instead of equites. So it meant only senators could pass judgments, not knights, or rather first-rank citizens. They're interesting people, but let's consider this in the full context. Punic Wars had been over some 146 BC. Yes, there'd been Jugurthia War and various other things going on, but nothing really of the same level as the Punic Wars for 33 years. Cimbrian War is really the first time since then that the Romans are facing battles in their own territory at home, and they are having to send a mass army to fight. Not just volunteers and not just the ones who want to go. Now, let's look at this. When, presumably because he considers so rude about Novus Homo, Scipio we can consider probably from patrician family, a higher status of family. So could have got to consul at the age of 40. So it was probably born in 146 BC. In comparison, our good friend Maximus, well, he's a new man. So that means he would have had to have been at least 42 before he could become consul. It's his first time as consul, so we know he roughly is 42. So if he's 42 in 105 BC, 147, then he's at least 42 in 105 BC. Then probably he was born in 147 BC. And then you have to wait 10 years before you can come around again and become senior consul. At least 10 years. Following consul, your service as a consul, you can be retained each year as a proconsul. There is someone we're going to talk about in a second called Gaius Marius. Later on in this, actually, not in a second, but a little bit longer, who is a proconsul years later after he served as consul. But the point is, you're a general / governor. You are the rulers of the republic. So, consul is boss. Doesn't matter whether you're senior consul, junior consul. The consul who turns up is the boss. You can be proconsul, whatever you like, but you are not senior to the consul. You're supposed to follow their instructions. And let's consider all these things that they've probably had to do. Military tribune, quaestor, or tribune of the plebs, aedile or proquaestor, praetor, all these things to get to consul. And you will have needed to do these because if you haven't ticked them off, you're going to be in trouble. You're not going to qualify for the post. You can put yourself forward for it, but the way the Roman elections go and the way the Roman electorate is, they're not going to support you if you haven't got the experience. So, inexperienced. Maybe he hasn't got as much military experience as a consul or another proconsul who's been leading his army in the field for a year and has done other things. But he's probably also the older man. And he's still got enough experience that he should have been trained by the system to actually be in charge. And that's the point. Now, legates, they're interesting. Legates normally, If you're talking about a senior legate, you're talking about someone who's probably been at least a praetor, might have even been a consul, if they're a very good friend of yours, and they've come along to help you out as your senior legate. Senior legate is an interesting one other than a consular army. You could well find someone. It would depend on how. If you're the senior consul, you probably have a friend who's going, "Oh, I'll come along as be your senior legate. I don't mind. I've got another X number of years before I can go for consul again myself, and I'm no longer pro-consul of my own army, so I'm bored. I'll come fight alongside your mate and be your second in command." That's quite normal. But again, you're talking people, they would have to have a significant experience. Tribunes could be 20 years old. But again, they're not the senior tribunes, especially in the army and the legion, are going to be older than that. Quaestor has to be at least 30. Tribune and plebs, at least 27. In simple terms, you're not running up the ranks quickly, are you? But the point for Scipio was that Maximus was novus homo. He was a new man. But I think he makes more of this, and his inexperience, he kind of protests too much in some of the accounts. My view is quite simple. He was made a consul in 106 BC. He went and took the Cisalpine Gaul as his place, as his governorship. And he was waiting there, hoping that these people would come his way and he could fight a battle and get the glory. And they didn't. By the time they turned up, there was an annoying consul there with his army, and because he's the consul and Scipio's the proconsul, he wouldn't get any of the glory. And he'd been waiting a year to get the glory so he could have the triumph, get all the money, and return home with victory. And the thing is, Scipio had already had issues with this and does have some bad accounts about him. After all, there are accounts of money disappearing after previous operations. It gets interesting when you get into the history. And this is the area, a modern map of the area, where they pick. Now, Orange, lovely town in the south of France, is modern Arausio. It takes place between the Arausio and the Rhone, the River Rhone. This sort of area would seem about sensible. Now, pre the battle, Maximus gets there first. Maximus comes up, leaving behind Publius Rutilius Rufus, the gentleman whose account of the losses we were telling out earlier, because, well, the senior consul, Rufus, seems to be a bit ill. That's one of the good reasons why he didn't actually go command. And honestly, if the senior consul had been there, one wonders if Scipio would have still tried to demur. He couldn't have claimed Rufus was a new man. He certainly couldn't have claimed he didn't have the innate patricianist to be in charge. So he'd have had to come up with another reason why he wasn't taking his orders. But the thing is about Rufus versus Maximus is that I have to admit, Rufus, as a good friend of Gaius Marius and a few others, and considering his previous military experience, if he'd been there in charge, might well have walked into Scipio's camp and cut his head off. That is one of the options of dealing with a annoying proconsul. It's not usual because that kind of could trigger off a civil war. And if we consider what happens as time goes on, as the army professionalizes, and you do get this happening again, that is pretty much what happens to cause the civil war, the civil wars between Sulla and Marius, and between, well, between various people, between various sides, the later on rise of Caesar. Now, prior to battle, Marius gets there. Maximus gets there first, sets up his camp. Okay, sends Scarus north to set up his reconnaissance camp and picketing group. Now, at this point, Scipio eventually turns up, sets up his camp the other side of the river. Now, we know they were there for a while. Why do we know they were there for a while? Because you had time for people to go back to complain to the Senate, tell them what was going on, and for the Senate to send out envoys to come and tell the Scipio, you're supposed to be following the consul's orders here. Scipio, eventually, when the Senate kicks him off, moves his camp to the other side of the river. So he's on the same side of the river as Maximus. But he still refuses to join camps and fall under Maximus's command. He keeps his army separate. Now, prior to the battle, and the battle's an interesting thing, of course, Scarus's advance party get overrun. They start negotiations because fighting a battle is not the only way to win this. A negotiated settlement, sorting things out, finding a balance that's appropriate to all sides, is another way to claim victory. Now, let's guess. Who were the Cimbri negotiating with, and the Teutons? They would understand. They seem to understand enough about the Roman structures to know what are the other alternatives to going into becoming concubines and slaves. So perhaps they also understood enough about Roman customs to know the difference between a consul and a proconsul. So who are they negotiating with? Probably Maximus. And this annoys Scipio, as the victory will go to Maximus, which indefinitely in this case, because the negotiation will go with the consul. And any battle which Maximus initiates, the victory will go and the honours will go to Maximus. So what are Scipio's options? To attack. Now, there is something interesting here, because some of the that survive, even to this day, and even quite recent descriptions of the way they fight, is interesting, let's say. Theodore Mommsen, in this point, describes the Teutons and Cimbris as fighting as their system of warfare was substantially that of the Celts of this period, who no longer fought as the Italian Celts had formerly done, bareheaded and with merely sword and dagger, but with copper helmets often richly adorned and with a peculiar missile weapon, the materis. A large sword was retained and a long narrow shield, along with which they probably wore also a coat of mail. They were not destitute of cavalry, but the Romans were superior to them in that arm. Their order of battle was as formerly a rude phalanx, professedly drawn up with just as many ranks in depth as in breadth. First rank of which, in dangerous combats, not unfrequently tied together their metallic girdles with cords. Okay, well, having less capable cavalry than the Romans is kind of a weird thing, considering the perennial problem for Romans is that their cavalry is usually terrible. There's also the fact that the Roman cavalry was apparently the Roman cavalry picket was apparently annihilated, so they don't seem to strike me as that well organized. A rude phalanx, drawn up with just as many ranks in depth as in breadth. That sounds like a fighting square. Okay, that's not a necessarily bad formation, and certainly it would only really don't make sense if you're using some kind of polearm, which it seems they must have been because of the way some of the actions that took place. So it would suggest they have at least spears as well, and honestly, the sword seems to be something various historians of a certain period are obsessed with. But as anyone who's ever seen any actual fighting, the likelihood is it was axes. Let's be honest, axes are far more common in every period for fighting than swords, because it's a lot easier to get the material to make an axe than it is a sword. In fact, the material used to make a sword can make many, many axes. And if you're arming a large enough army, and we're talking about a force of roughly 200,000, probably not all, probably that's not all the soldiers, but that's the old people grouped together. If you've got the logistics and infrastructure of the Romans behind you, yeah, you can field an army of swords. But most of us are not going to. So, whilst yes, probably, possibly the elite warriors and some of the more some of the warriors who've achieved more prestige probably do carry swords. I wouldn't be surprised if the vast majority didn't have axes. Now, their manners were rude. Okay, well, what does that have to do with their fighting? Flesh was frequently devoured raw. This is, if we consider the various things going on, that seems a bit strange and a bit unsanitary. But there are lots of people who eat cold meat, and raw beef is still considered by some people to be a actual delicacy. I myself am not that keen on that idea. The bravest and, if possible, the tallest man was king of the host. You're telling me they're picking their command leadership by their height and bravery? I'm not quite sure if that works out. Not unfrequently, after the manner of the Celts and of the barbarians generally, the time and place of combat was previously arranged with the enemy, and sometimes also, before the battle began, an individual opponent was challenged to single combat. These are quite common things for everyone in this period. The conflict was ushered in by their insulting the enemy on seemly gestures and by a horrible noise, the men raising their battle shout and the women and children increasing din by drumming on the leathern covers of the wagons. The Cimbrian fought bravely. Death on the bed of honour was deemed by him the only death worthy of a free man. But after the victory, he indemnified himself by the most savage brutality, and sometimes promised beforehand to present to the gods of battle whatever victory should place in the power of the victor. The effects of the enemy were broken in pieces. The horses were killed and prisoners were hanged or preserved only to be sacrificed to these sacrifices. They were sacrificed to the gods. It was the priestesses. That's pretty awesome. But before we get into this one, killing horses, I am very doubtful that the horses were killed. Prisoners hanged or preserved only to sacrifice to gods, that's fine. But horses are valuable things in this period. Horses are very valuable, and if you're moving 200,000 people, horses are not going to be killed for no reason. Now, if you've already got a horse that's injured and been hurt by the battle and can't be saved, well, then you'd kill it and use the meat for something. But killing a good horse for no sensible really reason other than to appease gods, well, there are ways to get round this, as horses are useful. It was the priestesses, grey-haired women in white linen dresses and unshod, who, like Infinia and Sivia, offered the sacrifice and professed the future from the streaming blood of the prisoner of the war, or prisoner of war, the criminal who formed the victim. How much in these customs was a universal usage in northern barbarians, how much was borrowed from the Celts, and how much was in peculiar to the Germans cannot be ascertained, but the practice of having the army accompanied and directed not by priests but by priestesses may be pronounced an undoubtedly Germanic custom. Thus marched the Cimbri into unknown land, an immense multitude of various origin which had congregated round the nucleus of Germanic emigrants from the Baltic, not without resemblance to the great bodies of emigrants that in our own time crossed the ocean similarly burdened and similarly mingled, with the aims not much less vague, carrying their lumbering wagon castle the dexterity which a long migratory life imparts over streams and mountains, dangerous to move to more civilized nations like the sea wave and the hurricane, and like these capricious and unaccountable, now rapidly advancing, now suddenly pausing, turning aside or receding. They came and struck like lightning. They vanished, and happily in a dull age in which they appeared, there was no observer who deemed it worthwhile accurately to describe the marvellous meteor when men afterwards began to trace the chain of this emigration. The first Germanic movement which touched the orbit of ancient civilization was a link to direct and living knowledge of it had long passed away. Now, the thing about Mommensen is Mommsen, Theodore Mommsen, is that well, he was born in the Duchy of Schleswig in November 1817 and died in Brandenburg in 1903 at the age of 85. He was a politician and archaeologist, eminent person in his period. However, the thing is, we've learnt a lot since then. And one of the things you find interesting in history is that we are always learning more. I can go through his account and take it to pieces, but this is honestly what people believed at the time. All history is written in a way which reflects the time it was written, as well as the understanding of the time it's written about. It's a fusion project. And I think they miss some of the history here which could have been put in. What I do detect from this account and other accounts is that we are talking about a force which has some military organization and capability, and is probably equivalently armored and possibly more experienced in fighting than their opponent than the vast majority of their opponents. There's also the possibility for the Cimbrian Teutons that they came from Doggerland, i.e., the area that just slowly slipped between the has slowly slipped beneath the North Sea. It's potential. And there are other tribes at times which are later on described by Caesar, etc., and others as descendants of the Cimbrians and Teutons. So they could well have broken off and settled up and made settlements in places they went around. They come from history, they come from somewhere we're not sure, they fight hard, and then they disappear. That's what we do know. We know them for many ways, these 4 battles, of which 2 they win. So it's a 50-50 war, but the Romans win the last 2. The battle. The Romans had gathered the largest force Romans had amassed since the Second Punic War. Now, the combined consular and proconsular army amassed at least 80,000 troops plus tens of thousands of supporters and camp followers. That's between 10 and 12 legions massed together. Now, a legion in this period could be between 4,000 and 5,000 troops. Sometimes Livy talks about them having 6,000 troops. And it does depend to an extent on circumstances. The thing is, though, legions are often matched in that you would have a legion matched with its Roman soldiers and then would have other soldiers with it. Now, we realize this period is unusual in that normally they amass legions in groups of 4. So you have 12 legions massed. Could be Vexillation from other legions, but this is a large formation. So if you had 12, each of 6,000 troops, you would be talking about 72,000 troops. If they're each at full strength at a larger strength. But we know there are at least 80,000 soldiers there. So, well, you also have the option of the ally. Now, the ally are the allied formations. And ally are sort of ally are sort of special. ALEA. They usually compose the wings. And, well, a typical consular army would comprise of 2 legions and 2 ally, which would be somewhat larger in number than the legion. So if the normal legion is 4,500, then an ally would be roughly 5,500. So if you have got roughly 6,000, you could be dealing with an ally of 7,000. Which means if you've got 10 legions there of 6,000, you could have then 10 allies there of 70,000, which would get you up to 130,000. If you have 12 legions there, each of 6,000, that's 72,000. You would also have 12 allied there of 84,000, which would get you up to roughly, well, let's be honest, 156,000. And usually you have roughly half again as many camp followers, supporters, and associated units. So you could be talking about having another 75,000 personnel there, which means the Romans could have had somewhere in the region of 231,000 personnel in the area. Now, again, not all of those are soldiers, and considering Scipio's army had already been together for a year and had been fighting, that's probably nowhere near full strength. And had it been raised to the 6,000 troops, we don't know. They could all be down at the lower 4,500 and 5,500, in which case you could have 12 there of roughly 4,500 troops and legions. In which case you would have, let's be honest, 54,000. And the other ally would be, let's say, 5,500. So you've got 12 of those, which is 66,000. So that'd be 120,000 troops and roughly 60,000 supporters. So that'd be 180,000 personnel in the area. We know more about the numbers from the number of people who killed than we do the numbers of people who were actually there fighting. But 2 very large consular and proconsular armies are there. This is another reason which is a problem. If Maximus had been sent with an army of 8 legions, 8 ally, under his command, he could probably have forced Scipio to acquiesce to his command by just the sheer show of, excuse me, these are how many troops I have. But they seem to be equivalent. They seem to both be roughly 5 to 6 legions. So they've both been raised by roughly 50. Well, let's put it this way. Traditionally, the consular armies, you raise 2 consular armies, and each consul takes 2 legions off and 2 ally and da-da-da-da. But Rufus stays at home, so he goes off with at least 4 legions. It seems to be roughly 6 legions. And Scipio has also had a similar scenario. So they've grouped together larger forces for dealing with the problem. As noted, Scipio comes across the river, sets up his new camp on the river side of the river, in different position. He seems to learn, as I can understand it, that the negotiations are going well. This is problematic. Maximus could get the credit. So Scipio attacks. Not the Cimbri or the Teutons. Scipio attacks. He attacks a position held by forces which are embedded in a position they fortified and secured efficiently. He attacks quickly without proper preparation, with everything he can get his hands on, which leaves his camp pretty much empty of soldiers. And he loses. He attacks a force which has a lot of skirmish equipment, a lot of ranged weaponry, and has strong infantry in a fortified position. And he tries to take them by speed. And he loses. His force gets pretty much wiped out. He'd only come over to that side of the river under orders from the Senate. He would have been the other side of the river, which would have actually given Maximus more time to see what he was doing and try and either prevent it or join in with it. Either way, Maximus doesn't have time to join in, and Scipio is defeated. Unfortunately, Cimbrian Teutons then descend upon Scipio's camp. They get all the stuff they want from there. Oh, it's full of stuff. It's full of resources. It's full of things. And then they turn on Maximus's camp. And the point is, you're facing a force which is probably roughly the same in strength as the combined force. So, this is where the problems start to really rack up. Because they attack Maximus, and Maximus has got the new, more recently raised legions. He's got them organized, he's got them in a camp, but he's lost his senior legate earlier, who didn't seem to be much cop, considering what happened to him, and he ends up losing his force, because trying to draw across a river in armor is not good, especially not in October, when the water is high, it's cold, and it's running. That ain't a good time to cross a river in armor in haste. Livy, quoting Vallius Arruntius, who's also quoting Brutus, the senior consul, Publius Rutilius Rufus, puts the losses at 80,000 soldiers and 40,000 supporters and camp followers killed. So, we can either think that it was 80,000 of 120,000, or maybe 100,000, or we can go for the larger 6,000 troop legion scenario and larger ally. We honestly don't know. But I'm not sure if saying it's larger makes the casualties more acceptable. It certainly, to an extent, makes more sense to me, because the supporters and camp followers, when they saw the army starting to defeat, would presumably start to run. And the armies wouldn't go down as quickly as all that. Plus, they're in camps, admittedly bad camps, with apparently their backs to rivers, and without the river on a good side. You always want to camp across the river from your opponent in a sort of defensive scenario. But if we go back again to this map, there does seem to be, this is a winding river which has many spaces around it. Now, admittedly, some of them look like canals, etc., dug in later on. But yeah, there are certainly spaces where you think you could set up a good defensive position, even with the river at your back. Preferably not the river at your back, but life happens. But they lose. And you lose a lot of people. And the aftermath is panic. You now have a massive army which has apparently lost roughly 15,000 killed out of their 200,000. And you've just lost your two large consular armies in Gaul. There is now nothing between you and them. If the Cimmerians and Teutons had marched south, they would have found, rather like Caesar, once you cross the Rubicon, there isn't much there for you to fight. There just isn't much. Senate goes into panic and blaming mode. Frankly, you can blame Scipio for the battle, but you can also blame Maximus for not having his position organized. And the thing is, he will have gone through this command structure training, so he should have had it organized. And the only reason you can go through this training and not have it properly organized is if the lessons of that war, the Punic Wars, especially the second and first, have been completely forgotten. Or rather, the people actually fighting in major wars aren't remembering them. And Scipio doesn't acquit himself any better. Let's be honest. He's behaving with ego. He's leaving his account. He's doing an disorganized attack. He's throwing his people's lives away. That's not professionalism. That's not experience. That's just stupidity. So the Senate does legal and illegal actions, which always tells you how worried politicians are, how illegal they're prepared to get. The legal actions: consul and proconsul are exiled. In fact, they're declared aquae et ignis interdiction, which means, by act of rogation, this is a special Senate bill, this means they are to be denied water and fire within 800 miles of Rome. You are exiled, and no one shall feed you, water you, or give you warmth at their hearth within 800 miles of Rome. Pretty damn nasty. Malleus lost both his sons in the battle. It is not known where he went in exile after the prosecution led by Suetonius. We don't really know where Scipio went either, but we do know he was still alive in 90 BC, as he describes that living his son, who died then. He was also fined 5,000 talents. This is another reason why I'm not that keen on Scipio. Because, well, around £825,000, that's pounds in weight, or 17,907,499,787 pounds in modern money, give or take a pound. So, the reason he's fined is because on previous expeditions, the money which had been captured from the tribes he defeated had disappeared. He was supposed to be on the way to Rome, but the group which was defending it on its way were apparently set upon by bandits who were surprisingly well equipped, and it disappeared. Bandits who knew the route, and the escort was surprisingly small. Amazing. Now let's consider their legal actions. They recall Gaius Marius, who is one hard... He is militarily disturbingly capable in this period. He is a very, very skilled officer. And this is despite the fact that he's been consul only 3 years. This is only 3 years after he'd been consul previously. Normally, it's 10 years have to pass, but nope. He's been off fighting, and he's been off fighting for those last 3 years. He knows what he's doing. He's proposed an elected senior consul. This is despite the fact that this adds, I would say, further information: the fact that Rufus, i.e. Publius Rufus, is ill. Because otherwise, you have the senior consul there. You form the army around him, and you send him off to fight. That's what he's there for. And yet he's sitting in Rome, and they call back Marius and make him senior consul. And he very much is a dictator for the next successive years. He's always appointed senior consul. He's always in charge of the army. And he steps into the role of Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucus, who had, of course, been the shield of Rome, along with Marcellus, who was the sword of Rome during the Second Punic War. You know, the person who'd been appointed to stop Rome being taken by Hannibal. He starts shielding Rome. He organizes his army. He raises his army. And he does several reforms in order to recruit a decent army. One of the things he doesn't want to do is rely on ally. He wants to recruit a Roman army. Now, there are many random pictures which go around which are supposed to be busts of Gaius Marius. But no. No, they're just not the case. We're fairly sure there are other people now, including one which is Scipio Sectaris. So, no. He fought in the Cimbric and Jugurthine Wars. He was a consul for 7 times during his career. He reformed the Roman armies. He changed from militia to professional soldiers. Improved the pilum. That's the sort of the javelin of the Roman army, the javelin spear. Changed the logistics of the Roman army, which was possible because of his professionalization of it. His military experience starts off with Scipio Aemilius at the siege in Numatia in 134 BC. He was tribune of the plebs in 119 BC, passing a law limiting aristocratic interference in elections, which surprisingly made him very unpopular and meant that he was barely elected praetor in 115 BC. He then became governor of further Spain, campaigned against bandits, and when he returned from Spain, he married Julia, who was the aunt of Julius Caesar. He attained his first consulship in 107 BC, became the commander of the Roman force in Numidia. That was when he ended the Jugurthine War. Now, he'd started off in 134 BC fighting in the Jugurthine War. Yeah, it's always fun when it goes on and keeps going on. Now, Jugurtha was the king of Numidia, and it was always fun to try and track them down. Remember, the Numidians had been the Romans' key allies against the Carthaginians. So, how the world changes. By 105 BC, when the Cimbrian Teutons won, the Comita Centuriata, which is the largest of the voting assemblies of Rome, elected Marius consul for a second time to face this new threat by unprecedented measure. And then he was re-elected consul every year from 104 to 100 BC. In 100 BC, after he'd won his great victories and been declared the third founder of Rome after Romulus and Camillus, he was really not good at the politics, and therefore he has to semi-retire from public life. He gets called back again in the Social War, which takes place in 91 BC, but he gets embroiled in a battle with his former legate, Sulla, which results then returned to Italy during the War of Octavius, seizing Rome, and, well, conducted a bloody reign of terror, described by some. This culminated in him being elected consul a 7th time, surprisingly, but he died at the beginning of his consulship. In 86 BC, there is a good reason to be elected consul. It makes you immune from prosecution. It's rather a good post to be in if you've had to do some very nasty things. And, well, he is credited with setting up the scenario which leads to the empire, but honestly, I would say it's the experience of this battle where the army had fallen apart and where the leaders had fallen apart that led to this battle. Because let's actually consider his reforms. The pre-Marian army is divided into the Velites, the Hastii, the Principes, the Triarii, and the Equites. Equites are the rich citizens who could afford a horse and were light cavalry. The Triarii are the final unit, and, well, idiom ad triarias reduce. To fall back on the Triarii was the final mighty attempt to salvage a desperate situation. They were an elite force and the force of last resort. Hastii were citizens who could afford basic armor, a small shield, and gladius swords. So they are pretty much usually young, aggressive men of middle to lower middle class, light armor, positioned in front of ranks. The poorest, the proletae, and the youngest, often younger citizens who could not afford a shield or helmet or armor were the velites. Unarmored, jambler and throwing skirmishers. They were not expected or equipped to hold the battle line. They were not really part of it. And then the Principes, who are the real core of the pre-Marian legions. Now, they stood directly behind Hastii, relieved them in the front line if they were unable to break the enemy formation by themselves, which was common because the Hastii are not as experienced and they get tired. And then suddenly you're dealing with the Principes, who are experienced and who are fresh. And the enemy suddenly goes, ouch! Now, if we think about this, both these formations went to the Triarii and they got Marian's reforms. Well, it created professional soldiers. The Capitae Sensei, the landlord masses that had often provided the velites, previously recruited only in sort of the Punic Wars and those things, were allowed to be called up. However, they could still not afford to purchase their own weapons, armor, and so the state supplied them, which allows you to start standardizing things. You're supplying weapons, you're supplying arms and armor. It's another thing when I sort of see it, hear this and this, and they have this sword and that sword and this things. You're supplying themselves. You're having to supply themselves. There's going to be a variation in quality. State supplies them. They're good. And also, you don't have to have so many supporters, so many hangers-on, because the troops bring their own stuff with them. And you can standardize the equipment of supplies. So you suddenly reduce the supporters and hangers-on and all those camp followers down. And you can focus in on professionalizing your legion. They're expected to carry their own equipment. The state supplies them. This reduces the logistics and baggage chain. Makes the army more flexible. It turns the standing army, which are turns it into a standing army because the volunteers who supply their own equipment want to go home and do their farming, which is where they get the money that goes their equipment. And the officers want to go home and rise up this beautiful system, don't they? They want to go home. They want to do their military service, and then they want to go home. 10 years service as a tribune. Woohoo! And then you want to go home. 30 to become a quaestor. Or, tribune of the plebs, perhaps. And then you want to go become start rising up the ranks. You don't get to command an army till you're a praetor, till you're, at least, if you get sort of the whole way up very quickly, probably you're going to be at least you've had to sort of be, it should be at least 34 to be an ideal. You're apparently to be a praetor, you have to be at least 39 or 37. So you've got to have at least experience. You're not going to get that just sitting in the army. Now, this also means you can achieve far higher levels of drill and professionalism, though, if you have these soldiers not going home. Professionalization means they don't want to go home to earn their money. They want to stay and keep earning their money by fighting. So you keep them and you get them more professionalized, and you get them more organized, and you have a force which is drilling on a regular basis. Then you add another incentive. This stops them running away in peacetime when they're getting bored, because when they complete their term of service, they get a land benefit, a grant, as their retirement benefit, and citizenship for the Italian allies who complete their full service of the Roman army. So that means you could recruit not just from Rome, but from the ally. So instead of you having the ally and the Roman legions, you had the legion, which recruited from both. And the ally would get citizenship, and there would also be Roman citizens in that. Because again, you got Roman troops. Not all Romans were citizens, because they didn't have lands and the status. Well, they were all citizens by the end of this. It professionalizes them. It gives them the experience they need. So, summary. Defeats are terrible things to have, but they are learning opportunities. What did the Romans really learn from this defeat? Well, in their shock and horror, they don't really learn enough. Marius is called home. He sets up the Marian reforms. He creates the professional army. But they don't see the big problem. The big problem actually wasn't the army. The troops could probably have won the battle. It's the command structure. The fact is, the Romans do learn and don't implement the same, have the similar problems happen again, but that's mostly through luck. And if you consider what happens, especially once you get into the imperial period, where as long as there is a strong emperor in the center who has the power and political capability to run it all, you're fine. But the moment that drops down, you end up with having more and more disputes over command. One of the interesting things I find is actually Rome gets more difficult to govern as an empire as infrastructure actually improves, and theoretically you should have better and better communications between the farthest parts of the empire. Why? Because they don't fix the problem of leadership they have from the beginning. You're professionalizing the army, but you're not professionalizing their commanders. Commanders are still the same system, which is an interesting system of people going between the two. And yeah, you could certainly keep that up. But to make that work, you would need to have something going with forces to go between the systems. You need to have reports come back from trusted people. If you consider, you would need something equivalent to the reforms instituted in the Royal Navy by Pepys, who, of course, instituted a system of getting reports back from everyone and actually, and some form of training system going in order to qualify people even more. You would have to put further qualifications into the promotions of people. And basically would have to bureaucratize it. And the trouble was always balancing the interests in Rome. You had a very aristocratic oligarchy running Rome and running the Republic. And balancing their needs and their interests versus the interests of the Republic. And they didn't see those interests as ever being different. They always thought they were the same thing. And to an extent, they were. But they professionalized the soldiery without professionalizing the structure about the command structure. And that was their problem. The armies, let's be honest, if we talk about the armies pre this period, Marian reforms, Scipio Africanus, it suffers so much politically in Rome. He is his rivals absolutely decimate him. At no point would his troops come and fight for him to attack Rome. But that's because they are part of the system, the soldiers, and they are in the system. The new reforms create a load of soldiers who are only part of the system once they complete their service. And therefore they're loyal to their general, because if their general gets wiped away, if their general gets discredited, what happens if their legion gets disbanded? They might lose their retirement. They might lose their service. So loyalty to your general makes sense. Loyalty to your commander, above all, makes sense because that's the one who's going to see that you get those benefits. He's the one who's going to go fight for you to get your retirement benefits. One of the big problems Caesar has is getting retirement benefits, those foundation of veterans colonies, for his veterans, because various people, factions in Rome, are worried it would make him too powerful. You have the same politics, you have the same egos, the same jealousies, but you now have them in charge of professional soldiers whose entire career and their post-career lives are dependent upon that general's favor. Ouch. You cannot reform one without reforming the other, and you need to learn from defeats as well as victories. And you need your politicians and your professional military operators to understand these things so they can see when these problems are coming. And that's where historians are really useful, because we will spend our days reading all this stuff and making these connections. So you can spend your days exercising and specializing and learning how to use all your equipment and lead your troops, can quickly read this up in a book. And that's why professional military education is quite so important. But as said, this is coming from someone, and I will admit my bias here, his PhD is War Studies from King's College London, which has been a centre for civil and military education in warfare and international relations and history of war for an incredibly long time. Now, I always finish these with a question. Well, not always. There are ones which will create enough discussion without me putting a question. Brooklyn class are a good example of them. So, today's question is very simple and very fun. This is the biggest defeat of the Romans after Cannae, and yet it is hardly discussed. I would like you, if you know, to write down what battle, put a comment below with what battle you think is forgotten, why it shouldn't be forgotten, and what lessons are you think of it. I'd love to hear that from you, because I'd love to hear what's going on. Ren, this, of course, Brooklyn class is done. Abruzzi class is next week. And these are some of the lives coming up. I have put them up for till January. And, well, actually, till the end of January. So you've got all the brew ships in there. You've got, on the 23rd of December, prior to Christmas, the Soviet Navy, 1918 to 1991. There might be going to be some long patrols about that in the Christmas specials. 29th of December, 1860 to 1960, 100 years of the gun cruisers. And on the 1st of December, German heavy cruisers of World War II. Hope you're going to enjoy those. You will notice there are some patterns in November, as if I'm away 1 week off doing research, and then away for another week off doing research, and sort of away back. That is my fun for November. And I had the Battle of Coronel in retrospect on the 5th of January, but do not worry, because in November there will be actually the Battle of Coronel Long Patrol. It's just I couldn't fit in with all the other stuff already put in, I couldn't put in the live until January. And I haven't decided on the live for the 26th of January. I've got 3 ideas currently competing. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Ba-ba-bum. Ba-da-ba-doo.